Morning. If I was to have a few minutes with you and I would ask you the question that is about our third item in our vision statement, has preached about the first two over the last couple of weeks. If I would ask you about the third item, which is, what does it mean to you to identify your unique role in God's story? I kind of wonder what you'd answer with. I think as I've pondered that question myself, I think I would answer it with probably, I want to know what my job is. I want to know what my role is in the church. That's kind of what we think of. And I know from my own life, in my own job, my career, we sure want to know what your boundaries are. You want to know what's expected of you when you come to work every day. So you might think of that. I want to submit to you that's probably not what we really want to think about in terms of this, of what it means to identify your unique role in God's story. Some of you may say, well, now that I'm a Christian, I want to identify my spiritual giftings. You know, do I have the gift of hospitality? Do I have the gift of teaching? Do I have the gift of communicating the gospel in some special way, in some role like that? Some gifting. I would submit to you that those are important. It's nice to know your spiritual gifts. It's nice to know those things, but I would say that's really probably not what we really mean by identifying our unique role in God's story. What I think it is, and I'll give you the bottom line up front, as we say, the bluff. You know, a lot of times in briefings, if you give it in the military environment, that's what you say. A lot of times the bottom line up front is your identity, to identify your specific and unique role in God's story is to tell your story of transformation. I'm going to do that today by reading and going through a familiar section of the Old Testament. It's a story of Joseph and his brothers. And some of you may be saying, didn't Pastor Tim preach a sermon on Joseph not too long ago? Well, he did. It was on September 9th, 2018. He preached a story on Joseph. He preached about it. And so I went back and reviewed it because I wanted to make sure I wasn't copying it. And I assure you I'm not copying it today. But it was a very helpful sermon if you want to have it. He gives a very good summary of the entire story. And he talks about a little bit different angle of it than I'm going to today. So in doing so, I'm going to start by reading the end of the story, or basically the end of the story in chapter 45. So out of respect for the reading of God's Word, as we do every Sunday, would you please stand and join me in reading Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." I've reflected on those words a little bit over that. You're terrified, but when somebody says, "Come close to me," sometimes that can feel so good to have somebody want you to come into their presence and talk. And despite, we know the end of the story a little bit here already, and most of you do, so you kind of know what's coming, but they were terrified. To hear "come close to me" might have been very terrifying for them, but I hope you see the emotion in this passage. When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler over all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly.' Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. May the good Lord bless the reading of his word today. You may be seated. So this is a familiar story to most of us. In fact, some of you will know, some of you who are my age, maybe a little older, will remember it was a very popular Broadway play. Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It was Andrew Lloyd Webber, one of his famous musicals. It's called a musical comedy. It's made to be kind of funny. I don't know that there's much in the story that's actually all that funny if you read the real scripture as we are doing today. I'm going to cover a swath of it here for a specific purpose. But you know why it's so good, and why it's an interesting story, why it makes a good play is because it's interesting literature from the ancient Near East. It's really good. It's a good story. It's got everything in it. It sustains attention and intrigue, jealousy, passion, temptation, faithfulness, rags to riches, and the prison to power of the main character, the hero, who is Joseph in the story. There's famine, there's fear, there's forgiveness. It's all there. And it's no wonder that somebody like Andrew Lloyd Webber would say, it might make a really good play. Already there. You know, some of the things I found out, what I think is comical about this a little bit is some of the characters who played Joseph in the Broadway play. One of them is David Cassidy, otherwise known as Keith Partridge. And if you remember, half the room doesn't even know who I'm talking about, the Partridge Family. He was the teenage heartthrob pinup boy of the 70s. I hated that guy. And then another one is even, in some ways, even more interesting. It's Donny Osmond, played in the traveling troupe of the Broadway play of the Osmond brothers and Donny and Marie. But you know, there's an additional truth of why this is a popular story and why this is a meaningful story to us. And it's because you're in the story. You can find yourself in this story if you look hard enough. And so you just need to figure out if God is the author of that story for you. So I'm going to go back and recap a little bit of Joseph's life. Of course, Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. And if you know the story of Jacob, you know that he really wanted to marry Rachel. He had to work 7 years. The father-in-law Laban said, "We got to work 7 years before you can marry Rachel." And then he tricks him in the end, and he presents Leah to him. So he ends up having to marry Leah, and he has 6 children by Leah. He has to work 7 more years before he can marry Rachel. In the meantime, he has those 6 children of Leah, and he also has 4 from concubines. We don't understand that culture. That makes us feel kind of creepy. To know that, but that was the culture of the day. He had concubines, and he had 4 other children by then. So there were 10 sons that were born before he even married Rachel. And he marries Rachel, and she can't conceive, as is often the case in biblical stories. They can't conceive right away. Ultimately, she does, and she bears him a son, Joseph. And Joseph is the one Jacob loves above all the rest. And it shows in a few different ways. One of the ways, of course, is he gets his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which we don't really know. It was a coat of many colors. We think it was that, depending on the Hebrew wording. But what it really means is a coat that symbolizes royalty. So it was long down to the ankles, and it was a long sleeve coat. And so he has this coat that he gets to wear around. And imagine what that would do to brothers who already have a favorite, who already know that Joseph is the favorite. The brothers are very jealous. And then Joseph, being the young kind of punk teenager he is, he starts telling about the dreams he's having. It's very obvious to the brothers what these dreams mean. They're stalks of wheat that are bundled together, one standing up, and all the rest of them are bowing down to the one stalk. And in another dream, he decides to tell him, he says, "The sun, moon, and 11 stars are bowing down to me." Well, the brothers get the idea of what this means. It means that he thinks he's going to rule over them. The brothers will have none of that. And I know even as I say this story, there are some of you in the audience today that brings back certain memories to you of the way you grew up. Maybe you weren't the favorite child. You can kind of relate. You're in this story somewhere. Maybe you were the favorite child, and you've kind of felt guilty about it. Maybe you've used that you were favorite child over your siblings. So you're in the story somewhere. It's trying to find out kind of where you are in this story of Joseph. This is the story of Joseph's life and his brothers. We're talking about identity and about being able to tell our story. Look for yourselves in these, in the biblical, and especially in the Old Testament. There are wonderful stories that are the gospel message. I'm going to talk more about that. So by all accounts, of course, he's a spoiled brat. Joseph is very spoiled. The brothers see him coming one day. Dad sends him out, says, go find your brothers. Imagine he's got to go check. The younger brother has to go check on the older brothers. By the way, there's one other brother born to Rachel. His name's Benjamin. He's younger. He comes important to the story in a little while. Rachel dies in childbirth. So the relationship that Jacob has with Joseph becomes even more important to him because it's that symbol of that love that he had to wait so long to have and the one that really mattered to him. The one that mattered to him the most. So here we are. Joseph's coming out. He's going to try to check on his brothers. The brothers see him coming. You know the story. They throw him in a pit. They decide, well, maybe we should just kill him, get rid of our problem. Reuben, the oldest, says no. He says, no, we can't do that. He's basically our flesh and blood. We can't just kill him. Let's just decide let's figure out what to do in a little while. Well, Judah, who's the fourth brother, sees an Ishmaelite caravan coming. Now, there's a lot of deep symbolism in there, too, because of the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. Ishmael gets sent away prior to this story that we're reading today, and he becomes an own nation. Ishmaelite caravan is coming by, and they sell. Judah's idea is, let's sell our brother, and let's make up a story then what to tell our dad. So they sell him into slavery. Joseph ends up in Egypt. Of course, the Technicolor dream coat has goat's blood spilled on it. They say, look, he's been killed. We go back to their father. He's been killed by an animal out in the field, coming out to look for us. His father is distraught. He says, he tells the brothers, I'm going to mourn for the rest of my life over this. For the rest of my life. Well, Joseph ends up in Egypt. He's actually a hardworking man. He gets bought by Potiphar's house, who has a significant role in the Egyptian hierarchy. And Potiphar puts him to work, and he's very successful. He's also evidently handsome. That's probably why guys like David Cassidy get to play him in the play. In the play. Well, Potiphar's wife has an eye for him, tries to seduce him. And all through this story, these words are said, but the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph resists the temptation. He resists it a couple times. Finally, she tries to grab him, pulls his coat off. He leaves the room. She screams. Potiphar comes in, has him thrown in jail. She accuses him of attacking her. Has him thrown in jail. So here's this young man. The Lord is with him. He's been sold into slavery by his own family. He's now wrongly accused and thrown into a horrible prison situation. Moving forward a little bit, Joseph has the ability to interpret dreams. And so he interprets the dreams from a couple people. They come true. He says to the cupbearer, who he interprets the dream for, he says, will you remember me when you get freed? Because you're going to be freed in 3 days, according to the interpretation. The cupbearer said, yeah, I'll remember you. Well, the cupbearer doesn't remember him right away until Pharaoh is having dreams, and he can't quite understand what they mean. And the cupbearer remembers a couple years later, and he says, I remember this guy down in prison. Why don't you go talk to him? Talk to Joseph. And I apologize. I don't have, my head size is a little different from the person who normally wears this, and so you might be hearing a lot of crackling. And so he says that Joseph comes and he interprets the dreams to Pharaoh, and he says, I know what the dreams mean. You're going to have time of abundance, but then you're going to have 7 years of famine. 7 years of famine. And the Pharaoh's wondering what to do about it. And Joseph has a plan. Joseph's a good administrator. He says, you know what? We need to save up now. We need to save up now. We save all our grain as much as we can now. Only eat what you need. And we're going to save it up. And when we're time of famine, then we'll be able to supply our needs. In fact, he ends up, it says, he supplies the needs of the world. The known world at the time come to the Egyptians to buy grain so that they can live. Well, fast forward again, and we're 2 years into the famine, and we find ourselves in Jacob's house. And the 10 brothers, plus Benjamin, they're sitting around on the couch. They evidently aren't doing much. They're starving. And he says, what are you guys doing sitting here on the couch? You get down to Egypt and get us some food. They have some grain down there. You feel your own family situation in there somewhere? Have you been the one to say that to your kids? Why don't you just need a job? Why don't you get a job? Or maybe you heard that. What are you sitting around for? That's all you heard from your father. You think, put a personal spin on some of these stories and you find where you fit within them. So the brothers end up tramping down to Egypt. They make it down to Egypt and they appear before Joseph, who appears as an Egyptian administrator. He's probably got a shaved head. He probably looks like Yul Brynner, if you remember some of those old movies. And he's powerful. They don't know that he comes from their stock. The one thing he can do, though, is he can understand their language. But he speaks through an interpreter to them. So he's speaking the Egyptian language, but he speaks through an interpreter. But he understands what they're saying, and he starts testing them. He kind of realizes who they are. He accuses them of being spies. He's testing them a little bit. He wants to find out what is the story here, and why isn't my youngest brother, Benjamin, with them? Why isn't he here? Have they done the same thing to him that they did to me? He's asking this question. So what he does, he devises some tests. I'm not going to go through all the tests, but they're tests of honesty and trustworthiness. Sends silver back with them to see if they notice that the silver they gave is now back in their packs. They get back. One of the things he tells them is, says, don't come back here for grain if you don't bring your brother Benjamin with you. You're not going to get an audience with me. And so they go back and they tell their father this. Their father, we're not going to have an audience with him if we don't bring Benjamin. The father is distraught again. He says to him, I'll die if you take Benjamin and he doesn't return to me. I will die. Finally, there's one brother that steps up and says, you know what? He says, we have to, Dad. If you want us to eat, we have to take Benjamin with us. And he says, I'll be responsible for him. I will do it. Well, there's a story. That's Judah. He's the one. Well, Judah, there's a chapter 38 of Genesis, which is kind of smack dab in the middle of the story of Joseph, is this odd chapter about what happened to Judah after he sold his brother into slavery. He goes off and he gets married. And he has 3 sons. And the first son, marries Tamar. Is evil in the sight of the Lord, and he's put to death. Well, he doesn't have a firstborn son. And under the rules and the customs of the day, it's called Levirate marriage. The way inheritance was handed down, it went to the firstborn son. The responsibility, if he didn't have another son, if that one died, because then the inheritance would go to the grandson. If you didn't have a firstborn son, the second-born brother had to take that on and sire the child. But that second-born son didn't get any of the inheritance. It went to the child, which was considered the son of the firstborn. So track that a little bit. That would not make sense to us at all. Well, it didn't make sense to Onan, the younger brother. He didn't consummate the marriage. He didn't live up to his responsibility. And guess what happened to him? He was put to death. Now, we don't understand that. I get that. That makes us feel a little uncomfortable that God's taking those types of actions. But hear out the rest of the story. The third-born son then would naturally step up under this requirement. The third-born son was too young to marry Tamar. And so what Judah does, instead of taking her in as his responsibility until such time as the youngest brother was old enough to marry Tamar, and to have that child for the inheritance to be passed on, he sends her back to his family, which is something that you just didn't do in that time frame. When you got married, you weren't part of that family that you came from anymore. They weren't responsible for you. So she was essentially destitute, left to fend for herself. And what does she do after some time goes by? She devises a plan because she needs help. She can't hardly eat. She can't take care of herself. She devises a plan. She dresses up like a prostitute and hears that Judah is coming to the city gate, dresses up like a prostitute, and seduces him. Now, she's pretty shrewd in doing this because you know what she takes? She takes his American Express card and his Social Security card, and she keeps it. The long and short of that story is finally he's looking for it, and then it's revealed what has happened. He has had an illicit relationship with his daughter-in-law. And the words out of Judah's mouth are this. He says, you are more righteous than I, Tamar. It's not about the moral equivalency. It's not any about that. It's about, I didn't do the right thing. I didn't uphold my responsibility, and I didn't take care of you, and you are more righteous than I because I didn't do that. That was my responsibility to do. I will own up to that and live up to that. And so that's where we see Judah now in the story, back in the story of Joseph. We've got this backstory of him sort of being like realizing, I got to kind of change my ways a little bit maybe. Well, they're back into Egypt. They come back. The father finally relents. The brother Benjamin gets to come with them. There's a reunion there of sorts. Joseph is very happy to see his youngest brother is still alive, but he's still wondering, have they really changed? So he tests them one more time. He says, go back. I want you to go back and get your father. I'll go back. Take the food with you. Next time, bring your father back with you. But what he does is he says to his steward, he says, put a silver cup into the youngest boy's pack. And then after they're about a day out, I want you to go get it. Go find it. So that happens, and that's where we pick up the story today, just before what I read this morning in chapter 45, and it's in Genesis chapter 44. And so this is what happens. The steward's out there. He says, I know one of you have this silver cup. Why are you stealing from my master? They said, we didn't steal from him. Did you steal from him? We didn't take the silver cup. How would we do that? We brought all the silver back he gave us the first time. We didn't take the silver cup. And then this is what happened. He says, each of them quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. Then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. He went right down the line. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, the youngest. At this, they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. And I want you to hear that line. They all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. You know what they were probably predisposed to do in years earlier? Let Benjamin go. That's the one they found the silver cup in. But they all go. They all go to face the music before the head administrator at work. He was the right hand of Pharaoh. And then I want you to hear when they get to Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph yet. And who steps up? Who steps up to tell the story, to tell what's going to happen, to take on the responsibility? He said, this is Judah. Judah with this scoundrel life, this past that he's got, selling his brother into slavery, having an illicit relationship with his daughter-in-law. He says this, what can we say, my Lord? Judah replied, what can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. Well, they weren't guilty of stealing the cup. What's he saying? That God has uncovered the guilt of their sin from 20 years ago when they sold their brother into slavery. They don't even know they're talking to their brother, but they're feeling that guilt in their life. That's their story. See, God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who was found to have the cup. But Joseph said, far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you, go back to your father in peace. Then Judah went up to him and said these words, pardon your servant, my Lord. Let me speak a word to my Lord. Do you know how much bravery that took to go up and request an audience with somebody as powerful as an Egyptian ruler that Joseph was? He said, do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servants, do you have a father or brother? And we answered, we have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. So I want you to hear the emotion, as I said earlier, the emotion in Scripture. Sometimes we read over these passages, we want to get through so many chapters a night, or we want to get through the story. We don't really hear the emotion. Do you hear the words that were running through Judah and probably the rest of the brothers' minds all their life? They're said here. We have an aged father, and there's a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. What about us, Dad? You never talk about us. You never seem to care about us. Can you see that pain that's behind that? That's behind that story. And those words. And then you said to your servants, bring him down to me so I can see him for myself. And we said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. But you told your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my Lord had said. Then our father said, go back and buy a little more food. But we said, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us will we go. We cannot see the man's face unless the younger brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. What about us, Dad? What about our mom? That's the only one that Jacob seems to even acknowledge here in this story. You see yourself in the story somewhere? My wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant, Judah speaking, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Do you see the transformation that is taking place in Judah's life? Do you see it? He had these stories running through his head all the time. Joseph mattered more. Now Benjamin matters more. None of us matter to our father, but he started seeing things through his father's eyes a little bit differently. And you see, he was beginning to be transformed. And he willingly now was going to give his life for the sake of his father and the sake of his youngest brother. He was going to give us. See, this is called a pre-echo of the gospel story. We look forward to Christ. And Christ wasn't the scoundrel, obviously, that Jesus was. That Judah was. He wasn't the scoundrel, but he willingly gave his life for others. So you see, there are examples of the gospel story, the gospel pattern that are in the Old Testament stories. And you know who else was transformed in the stories? There were 2 transformations. We don't often think of it because guess what? The Lord was with Joseph. We don't think about Joseph being transformed. But what were the words that I started with today in chapter 45 when we stood and read the reading, scripture reading? They were these. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. You see, Joseph was transformed not just because they were now trustworthy, not just because they were shown to be having some integrity, but they were shown to have a change of heart. And so now Joseph, who has all the retributive power to seek revenge against his brothers, he could have them put in death in an instant for what they do out of revenge. His heart is actually changed. Even though he was serving God and God was with him, his heart was changed because he knew why all these things had happened. It became very clear to him. You want to know what they are? Here it is. He says, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? For his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And he said, come close to me. Remember I read that? Come close to me. I'm going to share something with you. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. You see, you're still guilty, brothers, of doing. You're still guilty and accountable for your sin. But I don't want you to be stressed and angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me to you. You sold me, but God sent me. So you see, these stories are intertwined as you're thinking about your story, your identity. What's your role in God's story is to find kind of where you fit and what your transformation has been. How has God changed your life? That's what's interesting to people, you know. They want to see a changed life. You know, I'm thinking about this story, and I realized that it's the real key to it is that God never is just saving you for you. He's saving you because it's not about you. It's about those others around you that you're going to influence because of your story and that forgiveness that he's given. Now, I know that some of those stories, when you hear them, when you hear shameful things that have happened in your life, or when you hear about the guilt of sin that you've deliberately committed, you know, all those things kind of come rushing back. We're human beings. We're emotional human beings. Those are going to happen. But you know, there was a change that happened to you when you became a Christian. There was a change, and there was a transformation. And that's what's important to be able to articulate, where you were to where you are now. I'm going to tell a quick personal story as we close here today. This happened in 2012. We had just moved back up here in 2011. My company moved me up to Maryland. It's the first time that Karen and I had lived in Maryland since first time that she had ever lived in Maryland. She's from Northern Virginia, but that I'd lived in Maryland since I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1986. So I was there from 1982 to 1986. One of the things I always wanted to do if I ever got back to this area was kind of figure out how I could have a role back there again, how I could serve back there again, especially as a Christian. You know, what could I do? And so the summer of 2012, I contacted the Officer Christian Fellowship representative, and I said, could I help out somehow? And he said, sure, absolutely. Want to come meet you? And so what he suggested after meeting me, and Karen was part of this too for a little while, after me, he said, why don't you participate with me in the Bible study to the freshman class? It's a small group of midshipmen. There's a volunteer, so it's not compulsory to anybody. They volunteer on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. So the academic year started. The midshipmen had already been there, plebe class, freshman class. They'd already been there for 2 months. And they're starting their academic year. They take like 20 credit hours, semester credit hours of classes. And, you know, they're tough classes. They're really stressed there. It doesn't matter whether you're a history major. You take calculus, chemistry, electrical engineering. You take all these classes along with English and all the other stuff too. You're loaded down. And plus you have a lot of military responsibility. It's a tough place to be. I thought, you know, that's what I want to help out with. You know, I've been through that. It's 30 years later. I really have something to offer. Well, so I went to the first one. About 12 midshipmen were there. 12 freshman midshipmen were there. Had a good time. The leader said, hey, I'm going to be gone next week. I have to go on this trip. He said, so you can go ahead and just take it. Here's a lesson. So I prepared. I studied. I'm going to show all my knowledge, my experience. Look at me. You know, it's about me. It's about me. It's about me. Right, so I show up, 7 o'clock. I'm there a little bit early. I show up, 7 o'clock, nobody's there. 5 more minutes goes by, there's nobody there. You know the 10-minute rule, right? 10 minutes goes by, I'm thinking, well, okay, I'm going to just leave, I guess. Nobody's going to come. So I wait another minute or two, and in walks one midshipman. And I'm thinking, I know what it's like. I said to him, man, I know it. He goes, sorry, I'm late. I said, oh, it's okay. I said, but you know what? I know you're really busy. I know the year's just started. You got a lot of things to do to get ready for the next day. You got to study. You got to do all this stuff. I said, you'd probably appreciate having the extra 50 minutes or so. I said, why don't you just go on back to your room? And he looked at me, and, you know, I told this story in the first service, too, and it's still, every time I tell it, it brings some emotion to me because it slapped me right in the face. 48-year-old man at the time, supposedly this good Christian, wanting to impart knowledge to people was what I thought it was about, right? He said to me, he said these words, and I'll never forget him. He said, no, sir. He said, I need to be here. That was it. I need to be here. And you talk about the burden of the world coming onto my shoulders for a few seconds there as I realized what I had done, that I didn't do what he needed. He needed me to talk to him about my story, about where I was in life, about what it meant to be in relationship with Jesus and to be in relationship with him. That's what he needed. That started a friendship, by the way. I started a friendship that lasts to this day. I walked with him through his 4 years at the Naval Academy. He had some tough times there. It's a tough place to be, great place to be from. That's what we always say. You know, and it was tough times, and I got to walk with him through that and share my life with him. And you know what? He shared his life with me. And I talked to him on Friday night. I called him. I said, James Brasati is his name. I said, James, I want to tell your story on Sunday. I want permission to do it. He said, absolutely. He said, you know, it's interesting you say that. You tell me that story about breathing life into other people and about telling the story. He said, because I'm living in a house right now. I have a roommate. I have a roommate, and he's at sea, and so I'm by myself in the house. And he said, last week, 2 Mormons came to my door, 2 Mormon students. And, I didn't really have time to engage them, but I invited them back for dinner this coming week. And I want to sit down and talk to them, and I want to tell them my story a little bit. And I want to share with them my experience of Jesus Christ, and talk to them about the differences they have with us and share my life with them. And I thought, wow, if that isn't what this is all about, it's about being able to sit down and spend time with one another and tell your story. So my encouragement to you today is to know what your story is, your story of change, your story of transformation, your heart change. Yes, it has a lot of baggage behind it. You don't have to live a megaphone and tell everybody about it. Sometimes people may need to hear some of where you came from. Don't be afraid to share your story. You want to know what your unique role is in God's story? It's to tell yours. If you don't have a story today, if you don't have one of change, of heart change, these altars are always open. The pastoral staff here is always willing to talk with you. Come by during the week if you don't feel comfortable today. Give us a call. Talk to us. We'd be happy to talk to you. If you do have a story, please figure out what it is. Please don't be afraid to share it with people. The worship team's going to sing one last song. If you'd all stand and join them in singing.